Ari in Arizona has an argument for antinatalism. Awesome. Welcome, Ari. How can I help?
Hi, Matt. I was calling with an argument for antinatalism, and I'm describing antinatalism as a moral virtue, not necessarily a moral imperative. I have three premises and a conclusion.
Got it. Go.
Premise one, all humans endure pain, suffering, loss, and death. Premise two, the earth can only support a finite number of humans, and we are approaching a tipping point. I do have data to support that as well. And premise three, global climate change will make human flourishing more difficult in the next 70 years. Conclusion, it is morally virtuous to not bring a child into the world to endure pain, suffering, loss, and death, and deal with the impending climate crisis, while at the same time helping to combat the problems associated with overpopulation.
Okay, well, I tried to take notes, but so first of all, you don't have a valid syllogism. I know that you went to all this trouble to put three premises and a conclusion, but syllogisms have a structure where there's major premises and minor premises, and they need to be connected. And so premise one, premise two, and premise three don't say anything about morality or moral virtuousness, which means that your conclusion can't. There can be nothing in a conclusion that isn't contained in a premise preceding it. And so since the structure is invalid, I'll skip all of that because I didn't give you homework and you're not being graded, and we can just look at as charitably as possible what it is you're saying. So premise one is all humans endure pain, suffering, loss, death. Yes, that's true as far as we can tell. And generally speaking, human beings, perhaps not all of them, because there are going to be some people who are born that just, they live for 10 minutes and all it was suffering. But generally speaking, humans who live a life, it isn't one that is consumed by or wholly about pain, suffering, loss, or death. That in there as well is also joy and discovery and gain and health. And so a better first premise would be life includes both good things and bad things, generally speaking.
May I interject?
Sure.
I considered that. My premise is based on the fact that there is no guarantee for joy or any of the things that you're talking about. There's no guarantee of that in life, but
there's no
guarantee of the other.
No, the only guarantee is death, because you could be born and die instantly without loss or suffering, and death is not necessarily a negative. So if you're going to get rid of things that there's no guarantee of, then you get rid of pain, suffering, and loss, just like the other thing. But instead of doing that, instead of being that extreme and saying, well, there's no guarantee of anything good, we're talking about statistically. I don't think you're going to find a single person on the planet who's 40 years old who we can't point to one moment of joy or pleasure or happiness or anything like that. So let's, if we're going to be honest about this, okay. So that's why I said a better first premise is life is going to be filled with good things and bad things. But I would also argue that it's up to the individual to determine whether or not the bad outweighs the good. Because I've had lots of pain, suffering, loss, and death, but I have had nowhere near as much as many of my friends. I haven't led a charmed life. It's been a mix. But even if things got worse, that doesn't mean that those bad things outweigh the good things. When I'm in favor of death with dignity, and I have a friend of mine who did commit suicide, assisted suicide, because he had been suffering with a chronic illness for so long, so many years, there was no hope of recovery. There was no hope of anything getting better. And he reached a point where the suffering outweighed the good. And I think by and large, if we all had kids, now granted, I'm not advocating for everybody running out and having kids, but generally speaking, the fact that we desire to have kids and we desire to raise those kids, with some exceptions, means that there's going to be a guarantee of something good coming out of it, because you're going to be taken care of. If you're not, you just die. But it would be far better for us to just look at this and say, I would rather have someone of sound mind make their own determination about whether or not they want to continue life. But that we'll just hang that for premise one. Premise true. We're approaching a tipping
honestly,
point.
I will tell you that premise one is, I agree.
Okay. Premise two is we're approaching a tipping point with regard to how many lives we can sustain. I have no expertise in this area. I've seen numbers that show that the rate of population growth is no longer increasing, even though population growth is increasing, but the rate of change of population growth isn't. Also, whether or not, at what point we reach the tipping point is a matter of, well, there's far too many factors, but just because there might be limited resources doesn't mean that puts us in a position where we shouldn't have kids. But I'm going to skip over that one as well to get to premise three, which is global climate change will make I forgot. You want to read your premise three again?
Global climate change will make human flourishing more difficult within the next 70 years.
Sure. So I agree that global climate change is likely to make human flourishing more difficult. I don't know whether or not we're going to solve it. I do know that our chances for solving it decrease as the number of humans available to work on the problem decreases. But I'm in favor of human flourishing. But the fact that human flourishing is difficult doesn't mean it's not worth seeking. And just because it might get more difficult through actions that have had, people have taken which have had consequences, doesn't mean that that's enough to not bring another generation into the world. If the earth were on fire and everyone, brought into the world were going to die, then okay, now you can make a case that it's not just about human flourishing. We're actually actively encouraging human suffering. But what if the kid that I have tomorrow is the one that solves the problem?
I understand that argument, and I accept that argument. And I would also add that we're talking about real world solutions, and the idea that I would ever be able to convince 100% of the population to accept this is ludicrous to begin with. So the idea that I would ever be able to convince a significant enough portion of the population to become antinatalist is silly. This is simply about individuals making the decision to not have children when looking at the ideas, basically. That's why I went with moral virtue instead of moral necessity.
But I can appreciate that. But here's the strange. Yeah, it does. I can appreciate that. Here's the thing. I can't think of anything that's morally virtuous where I would say, oh, it's futile for me to ever try to convince people on the planet. Because if I look at something as morally virtuous, then I should be able to convince other people that it's morally virtuous. If I look at something that is morally obligatory, then I should be able to convince reasonable people that it's morally obligatory. We've done that. We've done that over and over again. And when people have made their proclamations about morality, when people are like, oh, sex outside of wedlock is immoral, we've managed to show them that that's not the case. Or if you wear a skirt this short, you're immoral. Or, all of these sorts of things related to morality, we've managed to overcome puritanical ideas. And even for something like veganism, where I consider veganism morally virtuous, but not morally obligatory. But if somebody said, oh, I'm with you, Matt, I think veganism is morally virtuous, I just don't think it's morally obligatory. But I don't think we'll ever convince enough people of that. I don't understand the futility there. I mean, I understand from a reasonable perspective that, you may not think there's a good enough argument yet, or that people aren't reasonable enough yet. But if something was truly morally virtuous, I don't see what the difficulty would be in showing it. Like, if you want to say, I don't consider. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, when it comes to veganism, I actually go the other way around with it. I argue with the other way around, that while I do agree with you that veganism is probably morally virtuous, or at least vegetarianism, I would argue that me reducing my consumption of meat and convincing as many other people as possible to also reduce their consumption is going to do a lot more good for the world than me simply cutting out all meat and not being able to convince anybody.
Oh, well, I would agree there. But I mean, there's no reason you couldn't do both. Like you could cut out all of it and encourage other people to do less. And okay, that'll have an impact as well. But it's a difficult situation. I'm talking about the fact that the kind of the proclamation about it being futile to attempt to convince other people that something is morally virtuous. I can't get on board with that. If, for example, I don't think that antinatalism is in fact morally virtuous at all. In fact, I find it absolutely asinine. And the arguments that people, it sounds like, fatalism, and the best argument I've ever heard for antinatalism is also ridiculous, which is we didn't get the consent of the unborn before we brought them into the world. Well, congratulations. Yes, nobody ever consented to being born, but that's because it's not possible. So if you're going to criticize us for doing something that's not possible, you need to show a distinction between antinatalism and the voluntary human extinction movement. Because if it was really eliminating suffering, and your view of life was so negative that it was just going to be suffering guarantee, every single day, you don't have a guarantee that you're ever going to be happy again. You don't have any sort of guarantee that you're ever going to have a moment of joy again. And so you could wake up every morning and say, you know what? There's no guarantee that I'm going to be happy today. I should end it all. And nobody would look at that as a reasonable course of action or anything that's morally virtuous. And if that applies to people who've already been born, I think it should apply to people who haven't been born either.
And also, I just wanted to clear something up. I wasn't arguing that I wasn't suggesting that I wasn't arguing for antinatalism. I was saying that it's impossible to convince enough people to actually make it an issue. Because even if I was able to convince enough people that it would make it an issue, it would immediately change my opinion, as I'm also a humanist and I'm not looking to end the species. So if enough people became antinatalist, it would make me a natalist.
Yeah. Well, that's, you're in a terrible fucking spot there, Ari. Or Ari?
Right.
I don't know.
Horrible. Before I answer to anything, don't worry about it, Matt. It's okay. I've been called much worse. Before I hang up on you, I did have one other very pedantic correction for you.
Oh, good. And I'm sure Arden will laugh her ass off at me being corrected for being pedantic.
Well, it's actually me being pedantic in this instance. I've heard you use the expression that I've loved and then started repeating until someone corrected me, that one can achieve altruism through purely selfish motivation or something to that effect. It was pointed out to me that all dictionary definitions of altruism include the words selfless. So I have amended the expression to an almost perfect example, a perfect facsimile of altruism.
Yeah, so
I'm going to go. Altruism includes being selfless. That's partly the motivation.
I'm going to go ultra pedantic on you and correct you in two different ways. First of all, dictionaries are prescriptive, dictionaries are descriptive, not prescriptive, which means they describe usage. They are not authorities on word meaning. So even if every dictionary on altruism mistakenly included that it must necessarily be selfish, that doesn't mean it's so. But the position that I hold is that one can do things that are viewed as altruistic even if they are purely selfish in motivation, because the judgment of altruism is that something appears to be selfless. Something appears to be selfless, even if it's not.
I 100% agree. Like I said, I've just changed it to a perfect facsimile of altruism just to avoid the pedantic correction.
There you go. Sweet. Thanks, Ari. You want to hang up on me now?
Anyway,
you can say, no, you're done. Tell me to fuck off. I'm happy with all of it.
No, you're done. Have a great night, Matt. Thank you for everything.
Thanks, Ari.